right. Well, good evening, everyone. I don't know if you've thought about this much, but isn't it truly remarkable that Jesus never sinned? I mean, he lived for more than 30 years and not once did he sin. I don't know about you, but how long do we actually go without giving into pride or envy or something else? But Jesus lived an entire life without giving in. And perhaps we don't reflect enough on this fact. First of all, the events happened 2,000 years ago. We know the end of the story. We know he didn't sin. It's just a known fact. And second, he was the Son of God. And perhaps we fool ourselves into thinking that maybe the temptations weren't so real for Jesus, that his success was a foregone conclusion. And yet we know, don't we, that he faced real temptations. We've looked at this verse a couple of times in our sessions, but Jesus was tempted in all points, like as we are. In fact, the temptations he faced were very extreme, especially in his last days leading up to his life or his death on the cross. And in my mind, I think the temptation to sin probably didn't climax on the cross, but rather in the events leading up to his crucifixion. Perhaps like when he's in the garden, when he's sweating great drops of blood, perhaps during his trial, when he's facing intense questioning and mocking by hypocritical men. And what I want you to do tonight is to try to place yourself with the Lord during that seemingly endless last night of his life, a night of never-ending trials. I want you to put yourself in the palace of the high priest Caiaphas. Interesting, isn't it, that it's a palace for the high priest? And to help you imagine the scene, Peter is outside in the courtyard. He's warming himself by the fire. He's going to deny his Lord 3 times. And I think with that in mind, you realize this is in the early hours of the morning, maybe around 2 a.m. And this is already Jesus' second trial. Jesus has been arrested. Most of his disciples have fled. The chief priests and the elders have assembled, and they're trying to devise a charge that will stick against our Lord. And all the accusations that they bring are false. You can see here in this passage, they sought false witnesses. They brought one after another, but no one could agree. And finally, they find 2 witnesses that agree, but these witnesses are actually twisting Jesus' words. They accuse him of threatening to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. And Jesus, of course, was speaking about his body, how they were going to kill him, and he was going to be resurrected on the 3rd day. But put yourself in Jesus' position here. Think of how easy it would have been for Jesus to respond poorly, to, in frustration, maybe threaten them back, or perhaps to overflow with anger and fight, or to allow himself to think evil thoughts towards the rulers. But that wasn't Jesus. And so Matthew 26, as we continue on, it tells us that Jesus didn't answer a thing. He completely held his peace. Look at his poise, look at his self-control. And when I put myself in that position, I think, well, how did Jesus resist responding to their hypocrisy and their lies? The thing is, these false accusations, lies, and slander actually continued for a long time. His trial went right through the night, and he faced the same contempt in a new location with a new judge the next morning. I'm just going to put up here on the screen for a second a slide that helps explain what Jesus went through. He actually goes through 6 different trials, a very short one in front of Annas. And Annas had previously been the high priest. This was like a preliminary investigation. Then the trial before Caiaphas, the one we referenced there in Matthew 26 in the early hours of the morning. When the sun arose, there was a more official trial that could be held before the Sanhedrin. And that marked the end of the Jewish trials. The Jews came to a conclusion, but they couldn't put Jesus to death, so they got the Roman authorities involved. So Jesus goes off before Pontius Pilate. I'll give you another verse from that trial in just a moment. Pilate sends him to Herod, perhaps hoping that he didn't have to be involved. And then Herod interrogates him and sends him back. So imagine going through a repetition of these false accusations for 6 trials for a very long period. Well, back in Matthew, just jumping down to chapter 27, We're now at that third trial before Pontius Pilate, the first before Pontius Pilate, I guess the fourth trial. And Jesus answers them nothing again. And it's not just before Pilate, the Jewish leaders are still there making the same false accusations built on their lies. And once again, Jesus held his peace. You know, there was opportunity to get angry, to make false accusation or to make accusations back. And we see the wisdom of Jesus as he just holds his tongue. I know that I wouldn't be able to take it. I don't think any of us do. We don't take accusations very well, even when they're true. We defend ourselves. We plan how to get back at others, but not Jesus. And this was his whole life. Jesus managed to do the will of his Father throughout his entire life. And how did Jesus succeed? How was he able, in this circumstance particularly, to control himself? Well, I want to suggest to you an answer. I could simply say he was the Son of God. He wasn't like that. He wouldn't sin. But remember what we were told in Hebrews. He was like us. He was made of the same physical things, the same physical stuff. He had all the same propensities that we do towards sin. But one of the ways that Jesus succeeded was by preparing. He knew the temptations were coming. The Old Testament told him to expect contempt, deceit, and lies. And it told him what his response should be. Now, I believe that in the days leading up to Jesus' death on the cross, there would have been a lot of passages that Jesus would have had running through his mind. Jesus often went into a quiet place to meditate and to pray. He's there in the garden the night before his trials. And scriptures would have echoed in his mind. He knew that many of the Psalms provided comfort and encouragement for these types of situations. There were passages from the prophets. Jesus would have studied these and memorized them, and they would have been there in his mind when he needed them. A few years ago, I had to go to a meeting where I knew there was going to be some disagreements and perhaps even some fireworks. And all the way to the meeting, driving from my house to the meeting place, I recited to myself 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not easily angered. It keeps no record of right or wrong, because I wanted to respond in the right spirit. So I pictured Jesus meditating upon Old Testament passages that reminded him of what he was going to face, and more importantly, how he should respond. And one of those passages that would have been forefront in Jesus' mind is Isaiah chapter 53. It's an incredible passage. It's all about Jesus and his trials and his death on the cross. And Jesus knew this passage, and he knew it referred to him. And what it told him is that when these situations arose, the best response was to keep quiet and not respond to the false accusations. So here's the reference here in Isaiah chapter 53, verses 6 and 7. And the first thing to note is that it is a prophecy. It was made about 700 years before Jesus was born. And when Jesus read it, he knew it was about him. And how, you might ask? Well, primarily he knew because it was about a lamb that would be sacrificed for the benefit of others. Remember when Jesus came on the scene, John the Baptist said of Jesus, "Behold the Lamb of God that taketh away the sin of the world." So Jesus would have identified himself as this lamb that's being led to the slaughter. And there's all sorts of parallels. If you have any doubt that this refers to Jesus, look at the parallels. Verse 2, he had no comeliness. He was despised of men. He carried our griefs and our sorrows. And what we're referencing tonight is that he didn't respond poorly in those circumstances. And things that hadn't happened yet, but he knew would happen, is that he would make his grave with the wicked. He was crucified with two wicked men on the cross, and he was put in the sepulcher of a rich man at his death. And his Father was pleased to bruise him. And so the prophecy detailed that Jesus, all these things would happen to Jesus, that he would be despised and rejected, that he would go to the grave, and that he would bring salvation for us. But it also listed how Jesus would respond. You can see there twice, it references that he wouldn't open his mouth to these responses. And while we consider this, his silence in the face of the false accusations, as another aspect of the fulfilled prophecy, It was only fulfilled because Jesus made it so. For Jesus, when he read it, it hadn't happened, and what it was really was advice. It told him how to respond. It told him the key to success. It was like the advice of Proverbs 13, but personalized. I mean, this is just good advice for all of us, that if we just hold our tongue or guard our mouth, we're not going to get into as much trouble. Think of how often you wish you had just kept quiet in a certain circumstance. But while Proverbs contains a lot of good generic advice, Isaiah 53 was written for Jesus. And Jesus knew that keeping quiet was an essential strategy for avoiding sin. But if you follow through all 6 trials, you'll see that Jesus didn't always refrain from speaking. He wasn't silent the whole time. He skillfully keeps quiet when silence was the right response, but at the appropriate moments, he responds. He stands up for the truth. Out of respect, he responds to God's high priest. When Pilate asks if he's the king of the Jews, he answers appropriately. You see, there was no prohibition on speaking, but there was a reason that Jesus chose to remain silent during certain parts of his trial. And we can find that reason in another Old Testament passage, one that I think is equally full of connections with Jesus' life or road to the cross. Our next 2 Bible Unlocked sessions are entitled Jesus' Thoughts on the Cross. They're going to be about messianic psalms, because there are psalms that, although written hundreds of years before Jesus even existed, were written for and about Jesus. And Psalm 38 is one of these. So here's a messianic psalm. We know the context refers to Jesus because in verse 11, his friends and companions stand aloof. We can picture them, staying away from the cross, fleeing from him. We see those that are seeking his life with snares. But once again, we see the concept of not answering. And that's fulfilled prophecy for us, but it's advice for Jesus. And so what we come to understand in this psalm is the real meaning of keeping quiet. Notice the parallel there between verses 13 and 14, that there's a person that doesn't open their mouth, and it's in their mouth are no rebukes. So as Jesus was keeping quiet, he was doing that instead of returning barbs or responding in like manner. 1 Peter 2 says, when he was reviled, he reviled not again. So it wasn't about keeping silent. It was about not sinning with his mouth. It was about not doing what you and I are all prone to do. And why? Well, I like verse 15. It's because he would let his Father answer. He would wait on God. This is the ESV, but in the King James, it says, in thee, O Lord, do I hope. Thou wilt hear, O Lord, my God. Jesus trusts entirely in God in his trials, and Jesus trusted the situation for God to give him a response. So there's a remarkable lesson in seeing that Jesus could look to the Old Testament, not only to understand what would happen, but to understand how he should respond. So what can we take away from these passages? Well, the first thing we can take away is that there's value in the Old Testament. Isn't that what we've been talking about in our webinars all the way along? It's the foundation upon which Jesus' life is built. And the second thing we can see is the strength that these passages would have provided Jesus. As Jesus progressed toward the cross, God gave him reminders that he was on the right path. Every event that took place would have been a reminder that God was in control. And Jesus would have been strengthened to continue on that path to the cross. And thirdly, Jesus received instruction on how to respond. I think the big takeaway from this session for me is that Jesus not only saw prophecy being fulfilled around him, he was fulfilling the prophecy. He was being told how he should respond. And when he did, he was making sure that the scriptures came to pass. The scriptures were guiding him in the things that he could control. And so the Old Testament helped Jesus visualize in advance the temptations he would face. And then they gave him the keys to success. And that's where it all comes down to for us, is that we look to Jesus for our example. Like Jesus, we should be looking to the scriptures for answers. The Bible teaches us about our human nature, and it teaches us how to overcome.